This is Deselany. Welcome to episode 1 of 90s Overlooked Underheard. So, yes, this is the first episode of a feature where I'm going to be looking at 50 of my favourite records from the 1990s, which I think have been possibly sidelined. In 1990, I was 18 years old, so I'm inclined to think that the further you get away from what you might class as your childhood, maybe the less likely you are to be swayed by kind of just raw nostalgia for the music or the art or anything of a certain period in time. So, yeah, I was kind of entering my kind of adulthood, I guess, my young adulthood at that time. So I'd like to think that I'm not being too kind of overly nostalgic about some of this music. I certainly definitely still listen to all of the records that I'm listing here today. So it's not that I'm getting all misty-eyed about the past. So the 1990s, it's a very interesting decade musically, I think, because of a number of reasons. There are some very practical reasons, like the technology of that period. It was in a great state of flux. So physical media sales from the beginning of the decade were kind of fairly evenly split between, vinyl, cassette, and CD. But as the decade kind of progressed, CD sales managed to kind of outstrip vinyl and cassette sales as CDs became cheaper, CD technology, players became cheaper, and it was just more convenient for a lot of people. It was the kind of the start of the decline of vinyl sales at that time. But at the same time, of course, the internet was beginning to loom into people's lives. And certainly by the middle of the decade, the MP3 format had been invented, I believe, in the early part of the 90s, 93 or thereabouts. And as more and more people were using the internet, then by the end of the decade, you had a phenomenon like Napster. And suddenly people could share MP3s, and it was the beginning of the non-physical kind of streaming formats. So there was a lot happening in the 90s in terms of how we actually listen to music. It's also an interesting decade in terms of the music industry of that time. It was kind of caught on the hop a little by various things that had happened in the very late 1980s. Certainly from a kind of a UK European perspective, the whole kind of explosion of dance music, rave, house in the late 1980s meant that there were people who were suddenly making and releasing music completely outside of the regular kind of music industry machinery. You could argue that this was kind of purely an extension of what independent labels had been doing, but the whole kind of scene with house music and rave music seemed to revolve around people being able to make records quickly and then put them directly into the hands of DJs. And music industry found this kind of quite difficult to deal with. A similar thing was happening in the United States with grunge, I guess, at the end of the very, very late end of the 1980s going into 1990, where labels were kind of rushing to suddenly try and sign grunge bands because they'd been kind of caught on the hop by the massive success of bands like Nirvana. So as a consequence, I think in the 1990s, certainly the first part of the 1990s, you see the rise and fall of lots of very short-lived musical movements or tribes or genre. They were springing up and then disappearing to be replaced by something else within within the space of a year or two. So you had things like Shoegaze and baggy or indie dance, Manchester, grunge, trip hop, Brit pop. It was a very dynamic time to be listening to music because tastes were changing very quickly, very rapidly. And it was only maybe by the end of the decade that you started to see the major labels, the big record companies, start to kind of get a grip of things again. You saw lots more manufactured kind of content, boy bands, girl bands. And through it all, kind of underpinning the whole decade, is this gradual rise of hip-hop and R&B and the way that those two essentially fused to make them the most popular music on the planet. So, yeah, the 19s is an interesting decade, and one that I have a lot of fondness for. And the music I'd like to talk about is, as I say, things which I think has been kind of slightly marginalized, not in the sense that these weren't big records or that they weren't popular records. I'm not going out of my way to pick the most obscure things, the most obscure records ever, although you may find some music in here that you've never heard of. It is just that I'm making this video from the perspective of looking back at the 1990s, and you seem to have this kind of overriding narrative that we formed over the years of what the 90s is and the kind of bands that were big. And a lot of music just gets kind of pushed slightly out of the frame by that, either because maybe the bands just never quite found an audience in their time, or maybe they didn't sit within the tastes of the day quite as well. There's all sorts of reasons why music kind of fades out of view, and I just want to look at some of that music. This list will be completely unranked. I'm not giving marks or anything. I'm not saying one is better than the other. They're literally just 50 records that I like. And I'll be presenting them chronologically. So we will start at 1990 and work through the decade, a couple of records at a time. I will be trying to kind of group things together if they happen to fall together on the timeline. I'll be trying to group things together which possibly have something in common, or maybe something we can talk about that connects them in some way. I won't be able to provide any clips or music myself on these videos. If you've watched any YouTube videos about anyone talking about music or discussing music, you'll find that the whole issue with using copyright protected music, even in a reviewing sense or a critical sense, is just a minefield at the moment. So I won't be doing that. This will just be me talking about music and maybe having a look at some of the actual records themselves up close. I'll also try and provide a Spotify playlist, which will just have a track from each of the records that I'm looking at. But anyway, let's get started, and we'll move on to record 1 in my list, which is from January of 1990, and it's the Sundays and their debut album, Reading, Writing and Arithmetic. So the Sundays, in fact, the other band that we will be covering in this video as well, are interesting because I think they really, in a lot of ways, reflect the previous decade more than the 90s. As you'd expect, really, because we put these decades in like little parcels, the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. But really everything is continuous. And I think in a lot of ways the Sundays are kind of the culmination of that 80s UK indie guitar sound. Their album was released on Rough Trade, and it was very well received at the time it was released. I think a lot of people were looking at the band, hearing the music, looking at things like, well, if you look at some of the titles of the songs, titles like You're Not the Only One That I Know, I Kicked a Boy, Hideous Towns. It doesn't take too much to look at that and think, we've got ourselves another Smiths here. And I think in a lot of ways, the Sundays, certainly this album of theirs, is kind of a spiritual successor, in some ways, to the music of the Smiths, which, just to put in context, the Smiths' final album was released in 1987. So by this time, by the turn of the 80s into the 90s, it had been 2 or 3 years since the Smiths had released anything. And they never would ever again. But amongst the music critics of the day, the Smiths was such a huge band that they were always looking for the next Smiths. And I think for a while, the Sundays filled that need. So what does it sound like? As I said, it's that archetypal kind of bedsit indie sound of the 1980s almost. Think the Smiths, think Lloyd Cole and the Commotions. But I think the Sundays are an interesting enough band in their own right to not just think of them as copycats. There are plenty of adjectives that you can use to describe the Sundays. Jangly, chimey, light, airy, clean. There's a definite kind of lyrical bent which leans heavily towards the feeling of bands like the Smiths. This is music for shy people, for people who aren't sure of themselves, for people who are yearning for more. It's a great record which kind of sums up the feeling of possibly young adulthood at that time, the need to break out of hideous towns, to find people who feel the same way as you. It's quite a joyous record, and I think it holds up very well. Musically, some of the influences are more interesting than just a standard take on the Smiths. The track Hideous Towns, which I've already pointed out, has a real strong early REM feel. David Gaverin's arpeggiated little riff and the kind of the hiccuping stop-start rhythm throughout the song is very reminiscent of, for instance, something off Murmur, off REM's debut album. The track I Kicked a Boy channels a lot of that kind of new wave pop that was a take on classic 60s songwriting. In fact, if you closed your eyes and listened to I Kicked a Boy for the first time, you might be forgiven for thinking you were listening to a record by The Pretenders, who are kind of arch proponents of that type of music. And the debut single from the album was Can't Be Sure, which is a very kind of sparse, slow burning song. Quite an odd choice for a debut single, but the song very much captures that feeling of being on the cusp of adulthood. It sounds to me like people who aren't sure of themselves, but are moving forwards, facing the changes in their life and just living with it. So the record, it's jangly, it's heavy on the guitar sounds of the day. There are points where you hear some of the contemporary sounds of the time kind of pushing at the edges of that songwriting. So there are hints of possibly some of the dreamy kind of the dreamy guitar sounds of shoegaze, but they're kind of under this soft pillowy blanket of guitar pop, 80s guitar pop. It's a very good record, and I think had it come out a year or two earlier than it did, it would be remembered a lot more. But I think with the change of the decade and these new musical genres springing up all the time, as popular as it was at the time and as well reviewed as it was at the time, I think when people look back now, they don't really think of Reading, Writing and Arithmetic as being a great album of the 1990s. I think it's a good album. So moving on to the second record in my list, we have from only a month later, we're looking at February here, February 1990, Swagger by the Blue Aeroplanes. I hinted at this earlier, but I also think the Blue Aeroplanes are one of those bands who you could almost root in the 1980s a lot easier than the 1990s. Possibly even more so than the Sundays, because this is not their debut album. They had released several records already on independent labels, mostly Fire Records, I believe. But this was their major label debut album. And it came on the back of them having a higher profile than they'd ever had due to some pretty big support slots that they'd been filling. They played support to REM on their Green World Tour. That's where I first saw the band live. And this gave them a kind of a push that they'd been missing before, I think. They clearly benefited not just from supporting REM, but from REM's support, if that makes sense. There is a track on the album which features some very, very subdued backing vocals from Michael Stipe. So there was clearly some kinship between the two bands. I believe the Blue Aeroplanes were selected by REM specifically. But Swagger, like Reading, Writing and Arithmetic, has its roots in, I think, the indie sounds of the 1980s again. The influences here, though, are definitely more classic. Classic folk rock, possibly. I certainly get some Fairport Convention vibes. The band themselves were a very big outfit. They had lots of members. They had, I think at this time, they had 3 guitarists in the band. But they would expand to accommodate all sorts of other musicians. And it had that feeling of a large kind of folky collective. They would bring in someone to play fiddle or mandolin or hurdy-gurdy. And the band had a full-time dancer as part of their live act, and he was credited on the albums. Definitely a very arty band, if you see what I mean, in a kind of the sense of, in a kind of art school sense. They felt like just this rolling, hyperactive collective of musicians that were all drawn around the vocals of singer Gerard Langley. I use singer very loosely because his vocal style is very much spoken word, very heavily poetic. They were a band that weren't scared of appearing arty, of referencing classic music, classic 60s music. They weren't scared of referencing classic literature. The opening track on side 2 of Swagger is called The Applicant, and the lyrics are lifted directly from a poem by Sylvia Plath. The sound of the Blue Aeroplanes is this multi-layered guitars, but never spilling over into noisier, more aggressive music. Always this light, melodic, complex, rich kind of folk pop. It's very easy to pick out the kind of influences of the day that so many indie or alternative artists would focus on. The Velvet Underground being the main one. But as I said, when there's a heavy folk leaning at the heart, I believe, of the Blue Aeroplanes. I've already mentioned Fairport Convention, but you do get strong elements of Dylan, and you do get a feeling of the Byrds at their kind of folk rock peak. Key tracks: Jacket Hangs is the opening track of the album and was the debut single from the album, and that has this kind of chiming, climbing, television type feel. If you think of some of the classic tracks off Television's Marquee Moon, it has that kind of feel. There's very light, airy, jangly, strummy pop tracks on here. There are basically 2 tracks on side 1 which seg into one another, so they kind of like form a pairing, and that would be the tracks Weightless and Stones. And Stones embodies the kind of embracing of some of the dance music leanings of the day. 1989 into 1990 was kind of the period of this indie dance crossover in the UK independent music scene, and you can see a little of that in Ant Stones. I mentioned The Applicant, the opening track of side 2, and later on the same side, Anti-Pretty is just a kind of indie pop kind of stomper, very catchy. So I think maybe these first 2 records that I've talked about will give you an idea of where I'm going with this. These are records which were actually quite they sold very well at the time. They were well reviewed. But if you were to kind of look back at the 90s now using this kind of media lens that we have, if you were to rely on an algorithm to pick you 1990s hits, I think you'd be unlikely to find the Sundays and the Blue Aeroplanes featuring in them. I may be wrong there, but they're a useful pairing for the first two records in this list. I think they're both bands that, sound-wise, probably you could argue they're far more rooted in a 1980s indie or alternative style. And they both feature vocalists with kind of quite a unique voice, either as an instrument in its own right or as just a mouthpiece for a kind of spoken word lyrical approach. I like both these records. I still listen to both these records. And I think they're worthy of your attention. There's some stuff underneath me right now. You can do any of those things if you like. I don't like self-promotion, so I'll just leave those there. Thanks for watching, and tune in again for the next episode in 90s Overlooked Underheard. Thanks.